The Grumman F-6F Hellcat shuddered violently as 20mm cannon rounds punched through its starboard wing. Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Harwell could taste copper in his mouth, his oxygen mask fogged with each shallow breath. The Pacific sun burned through the canopy glass, turning the cockpit into an oven. 7 Mitsubishi A6M0s circled above him like vultures, their red Hinomaru insignias blazing in the equatorial light. He was alone, 15,000 feet above the Solomon Sea. October 1943. His wingmen were gone, scattered by the initial bounce 10 minutes earlier. The radio crackled with dying static. His fuel gauge trembled near the red line. The engine coughed black smoke that streaked across his field of vision like ink in water. Every instinct screamed the same command. Dive. Push the throttle forward. Use gravity and the Hellcat's superior speed in a straight line. Get separation. Run for the cloud bank 8 miles south. That was what the manual said. That was what every combat instructor at Pensacola had drilled into his skull during 6 months of training. Thomas Harwell did the exact opposite. He pulled the throttle back. Way back. Almost to idle. The engine note dropped from a roar to a whisper. The Hellcat began to slow. Not gradually. Dramatically. The airspeed indicator unwound like a clock spinning backward. 200 knots. 190. 180. The stick went soft in his hands. The aircraft wanted to stall. Wanted to tumble out of the sky like a broken bird. The Zeros above him hesitated. Just for a second. Confusion rippled through their formation. This was wrong. This was suicide. American pilots didn't slow down when they were losing. They ran. They dove. They burned fuel and prayed for distance. But Harwell wasn't running. What happened in the next 90 seconds would be dissected by Navy tacticians for the rest of the war. It would appear in classified after-action reports. It would be whispered about in ready rooms from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. And it would force the instructors, who had once mocked a quiet mathematics student from rural Indiana, to rewrite an entire section of the Fighter Combat Manual. If you want more true stories of impossible moments from World War II, subscribe to the channel. 6 weeks earlier, Thomas Harwell had been the least popular pilot in VF-12. Not because he was arrogant, not because he was reckless, but because he carried a notebook everywhere. A small leather-bound journal filled with equations, diagrams, and calculations that nobody else understood or cared about. While other pilots spent evenings playing poker and drinking contraband whiskey in the officers' quarters, Harwell sat alone at a table covered in graph paper. He sketched velocity curves. He calculated turning radiuses at different altitudes. He filled page after page with numbers that represented life and death, though most of his squadron mates saw only a waste of time. They called him Professor, sometimes Library. Once, after he tried to explain energy management theory during a briefing, the squadron's executive officer had cut him off mid-sentence. Save the college lecture, Harwell. Just point your nose at the enemy and shoot. That's the job. The laughter that followed had been loud enough to echo off the corrugated metal walls of the Quonset hut. Harwell had nodded quietly, closed his notebook, and said nothing. He had grown up in a town of 400 people. His father ran a general store. His mother taught elementary school. There were no military traditions in his family. No fighter pilot uncles or decorated grandfathers. Just farmers and shopkeepers and teachers who believed that problems could be solved if you thought about them long enough. When the war came, Harwell had enlisted the same week as everyone else's age. But while other recruits bragged about how many Germans or Japanese they would kill, Harwell had gone to the public library and checked out every book they had on aerodynamics, ballistics, and physics. He read them on the train to boot camp. He read them during breaks in flight training. He read them until the pages fell apart. His instructors noticed. They didn't like it. Fighter pilots were supposed to be instinctive, aggressive, fearless. They were supposed to trust their gut, not a slide rule. Harwell's obsession with numbers made them uncomfortable. It suggested hesitation, overthinking, weakness. But he had passed every test. He had qualified on the Hellcat with scores high enough to avoid washing out. And when VF-12 deployed to the South Pacific in August 1943, Harwell went with them, still carrying his notebook, still scribbling equations that nobody wanted to see. The mission on October 14th was supposed to be routine. 4 Hellcats flying combat air patrol over a convoy of destroyers moving northwest toward Bougainville. The weather was clear. Intelligence reported minimal Japanese air activity in the sector. The squadron leader had even joked during the morning briefing that they'd be back in time for lunch. Harwell had been assigned the number 4 position. Tail end Charlie. The least experienced pilot always flew there. His job was simple. Stay in formation. Watch the rear quadrant. Don't do anything stupid. They were 90 minutes into the patrol when the Zeros appeared. They came out of the sun. A textbook bounce. 7 aircraft in a loose V formation, diving fast from 22,000 feet. The lead pilot was good. He timed it perfectly. The Hellcats were in a lazy left turn, their energy low, their attention split between the convoy below and the empty sky ahead. The first burst of gunfire tore through the number 3 Hellcat before anyone could shout a warning. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell, trailing flame. The pilot never got out. The second Hellcat tried to break right, but a Zero followed him down, pouring fire into his engine cowling. That pilot bailed out at 8,000 feet. His parachute opened just before he hit the water. Whether he survived the landing, Harwell would never know. The squadron leader called for a split S and dove for the deck, hoping to use speed and the Hellcat's diving performance to escape. His wingmen followed. They disappeared into the haze near the surface. The Zeros didn't pursue. They had spotted easier prey. Thomas Harwell, alone and climbing desperately, was now the only American fighter left in the engagement zone. He had maybe 5 seconds to make a decision. His training said dive. His instincts said dive. Every rational calculation said dive. But diving meant predictability. It meant the Zeros could follow his line, match his speed, and chew him apart with their superior maneuverability at high velocity. They were lighter. They turned tighter. In a straight speed run, the Hellcat had the edge, but only if the distance was long enough. And between Harwell and the nearest cloud cover was 8 miles of open sky. He wouldn't make it halfway. He thought about the notebook, about the equations he'd worked through during 100 sleepless nights, about a principle he'd read in a brittle pre-war aviation journal that someone had left in the base library. Energy is speed plus altitude, but it's also time, and time is the space between decision and consequence. If you compress that space faster than the enemy can predict, you control the outcome. It was abstract, theoretical, unproven, but it was all he had. Harwell pulled the throttle back and began to climb. The Hellcat responded like a wounded animal. The engine note dropped. The airspeed bled off in huge chunks. 170 knots, 160, 150. The altimeter continued upward, but slower now. The climb rate decayed. The wings bit into thinner air. The controls felt mushy, unresponsive. Above him, the Zero formation broke into 3 elements. 2 pairs swung wide to cut off any escape routes. The remaining 3 dove straight at him, their pilots probably assuming Harwell was panicking, freezing, about to stall and die without them even needing to fire. They were half right. The Hellcat was seconds from a stall. The stick trembled in Harwell's hands. The airspeed indicator hovered just above 90 knots. Any slower and the wings would stop generating lift. The aircraft would snap into a spin. At this altitude, he wouldn't recover. The lead Zero opened fire at 600 yards. Tracers arced past Harwell's canopy, bright and slow-moving in the thin air. The Japanese pilot was aiming ahead of the Hellcat, leading the target, expecting Harwell to maintain his current flight path. But Harwell wasn't maintaining anything. He kicked the right rudder pedal hard. At the same instant, he rolled the stick left. The Hellcat yawed violently, skidding sideways through the air like a car on ice. It wasn't a maneuver. It wasn't in any manual. It was a barely controlled disaster that used the aircraft's near-stall condition to pivot in a way that no high-speed fighter could replicate. The Zero's gunfire missed. Not by inches, by yards. The Japanese pilot shot through empty sky where the Hellcat had been a fraction of a second earlier. And then physics took over. The Zero was diving. Fast. Over 300 knots. Its pilot had committed to the attack run, trading altitude for speed. He couldn't stop, couldn't turn, couldn't do anything but continue his dive and try to pull up before he hit the ocean. The two Zeros behind him had the same problem. They had followed their leader into the attack, matching his speed, trusting his judgment. Now all three aircraft were screaming past Harwell's position, their momentum carrying them down and away. Harwell shoved the throttle forward. The Hellcat's engine roared back to life. The propeller clawed at the air. The airspeed began to build. He nosed down slightly, trading altitude for acceleration. 95 knots, 100, 110. The Zeros were below him now, scattered, out of position, trying to pull out of their dives and regroup. It would take them 15, maybe 20 seconds to bleed off speed, reverse course, and climb back to engagement altitude. Harwell needed 10. He rolled, inverted, and pulled. The Hellcat arced downward, picking up speed, following a curving path that brought him onto the tail of the nearest Zero. The Japanese pilot saw him coming, tried to brake left, but he was too slow, still heavy with momentum. The Hellcat's 6.50 caliber machine guns opened fire. The burst lasted less than 2 seconds. 50 rounds, maybe 60. Half of them missed, but the rest walked up the Zero's fuselage from tail to cockpit. Metal shredded, smoke erupted, the canopy shattered. The Zero rolled gently to the right and began a slow, uncontrolled spiral toward the ocean. Harwell didn't watch it fall. He was already pulling up, scanning for the next threat. His heart hammered against his ribs. His hand shook on the stick. The adrenaline was so thick in his bloodstream that he could barely think. The remaining 6 Zeros were regrouping. They had altitude again, numbers, experience, and now they were angry. This wasn't over, not even close. The second wave came faster. The Japanese pilots had seen what happened to their lead element. They knew now that the American wasn't running, wasn't panicking. That changed everything. 2 Zeros dove from the north, 2 more from the west. The remaining pair stayed high, circling, waiting to capitalize on any mistake. It was a coordinated attack. Professional. Lethal. Harwell's fuel gauge read 1/3. His ammo counter showed 200 rounds remaining per gun. 1,200 total. Enough for maybe 3 more engagements if he was disciplined. If he wasn't, he'd run dry and die. He climbed again. Not aggressively. Just enough to gain a few hundred feet. The Zeros adjusted, tightening their angles. They expected him to dive, to run, to do something predictable. He slowed down instead. Not as much as before. Not to the edge of a stall. But enough. Enough to throw off their firing solutions. Enough to make them second-guess. The Hellcat dropped to 140 knots. The Zeros closed in. Their guns opened up. Tracers filled the air around him like fireflies. And then Harwell's snap rolled right and dove. Not a gentle dive. A violent, wing-screaming plunge that pushed the Hellcat past its redline airspeed. The needle touched 280 knots. The airframe groaned. Rivets rattled. The canopy glass vibrated so hard it blurred his vision. The 2 Zeros from the north tried to follow. They couldn't. The Hellcat was faster in a dive. Heavier. Built like a tank. The Zeros were light and fragile. Pushing them past 250 knots risked tearing the wings off. They broke off. Pulled up. Tried to reposition. Harwell leveled out at 8,000 feet and turned hard left. The G-forces crushed him into his seat. His vision tunneled. He gasped for air through the oxygen mask. The Hellcat groaned but held together. When he rolled level, the 2 Zeros from the west were directly ahead of him. Close. Maybe 400 yards. They had anticipated his turn. Cut him off. They opened fire simultaneously. Twin streams of 20mm cannon shells and 7.7mm machine gun rounds converged on the Hellcat's nose. Harwell saw the flashes, saw the tracers, felt the impacts hammer through the airframe. One round punched through the windscreen, missed his head by inches, exited through the canopy behind him. Cold air screamed into the cockpit. Another round hit the engine cowling, punched through sheet metal, stopped somewhere in the accessory case. The engine kept running. Barely. Harwell fired back. A 2-second burst. The Hellcat's guns roared. Spent casings ejected from the wing bays. tumbling away in the slipstream. He saw strikes, flashes of light on the left Zero's wing root, metal tearing, fabric shredding. The Zero rolled away, trailing smoke. Not dead, but hurt. The second Zero kept coming, head on, guns blazing. It was a game of chicken now. 2 fighters, 2 pilots, closing at a combined speed of over 400 knots. Whoever flinched first would die. Harwell didn't flinch. He adjusted his aim, led the target, squeezed the trigger. The guns fired. 30 rounds. 40. He saw the Zero's propeller disintegrate, saw pieces of the spinner fly away like shrapnel, saw the engine cowling buckle. The Zero pitched up violently. Snap rolled inverted, fell away. Harwell broke right, climbed. His ears rang. His chest burned. He'd been holding his breath. He gasped for air. The oxygen system hissed. The temperature in the cockpit was over 100 degrees. Sweat poured down his face. For Zero's left, they were still above him, still circling, but they weren't diving anymore. Harwell climbed back to 12,000 feet. The engine stuttered once, twice, smoothed out. Black smoke still poured from the cowling, but the temperatures were holding. Oil pressure steady. Manifold pressure in the green. The Zeros circled, watching, waiting, and then they turned north and left. Just like that. No final attack. No desperate kamikaze run. They simply disengaged, formed up, and disappeared into the distance. Harwell didn't understand. Not at first. He kept scanning the sky, expecting a trap, expecting them to circle back and hit him from behind. But they didn't. He was alone. The radio crackled. A voice broke through the static. American. Distant. Any station, this is Overwatch. We have radar contact on multiple bogies, departing the area. Confirm status. Harwell keyed the mic. His voice was hoarse, shaking. Overwatch, this is Saber 4. I'm still airborne. Engaged 7 bandits. 3 splashed. 4 withdrew. Returning to base. There was a long pause. Then the voice came back. Saber 4, say again. Did you say 7 bandits? Affirmative. Another pause. Saber 4, you are cleared direct to base. We'll have the medics standing by. Negative, Overwatch. I'm not hit. Aircraft is damaged but flyable. Estimate 30 minutes to base. The controller didn't respond. Harwell didn't care. He turned south and began the long flight home. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. The Hellcat limped back to base, trailing a thin ribbon of black smoke. Harwell kept the throttle at 70% power. Any higher, and the engine temperature spiked into the red. Any lower, and he risked losing altitude over the open water. The fuel gauge read almost empty. The needle bounced against the stop. He had maybe 10 minutes of flying time left. Maybe less. The radio chatter increased as he approached the island. Other pilots returning from patrol. Controllers coordinating landing sequences. Someone requesting emergency equipment for an aircraft with hydraulic failure. The normal chaos of a busy carrier air station compressed onto a tiny strip of coral and coral dust. Harwell didn't call ahead, didn't declare an emergency. He joined the landing pattern behind 2 other Hellcats and waited his turn. The gear came down with a heavy thunk. The flaps extended. The engine coughed but kept running. He crossed the threshold at 90 knots, touched down hard, and let the aircraft roll to the end of the runway before turning off. The engine died the moment he pulled the mixture to idle cutoff. Just quit. No sputter. No protest. 1 second it was running. The next it was silent. Harwell sat in the cockpit for a full minute, listening to the metal tick and creak as it cooled. His hands still shook. His legs felt like water. When he finally unstrapped and climbed out, his knees almost buckled. The plane captain was waiting on the wing. A kid from Oklahoma, maybe 19 years old, whose job was to prep and maintain Harwell's aircraft. He stared at the damage with wide eyes. The shattered windscreen, the holes punched through the cowling and wings, the torn fabric on the elevator, the scorch marks where tracers had grazed the fuselage. Jesus, Lieutenant. The plane captain whispered, "What happened up there?" Harwell didn't answer. He climbed down from the wing, walked 3 steps, and vomited into the coral dust. The intelligence officer found him 20 minutes later. Harwell had cleaned himself up as best he could, changed out of his sweat-soaked flight suit, drank half a canteen of water. He was sitting on an empty fuel drum outside the ready room when the I.O. approached with a clipboard and a neutral expression that suggested he'd already heard something but didn't quite believe it. "Lieutenant Harwell," the I.O. said, "I need a debrief." "Yes, sir." They walked to a small wooden shack that served as the squadron intelligence office. Inside was a desk, 2 chairs, a map of the Solomon Islands pinned to the wall, and a single electric fan that pushed hot air from one side of the room to the other. The I.O. sat down, clicked his pen, and looked at Harwell with the tired patience of someone who'd interviewed 100 pilots and heard 100 stories that all sounded the same. "Start from the top," the I.O. said. "What happened after the initial bounce?" Harwell told him. Everything. The split formation, the loss of the lead and wing aircraft, the decision not to dive, the throttle reduction, the near-stall maneuver, the 0 overshoots, the reversals, the gunfire, the disengagement. He spoke in flat, factual sentences. No embellishment, no drama, just a sequence of events as he remembered them. When he finished, the I.O. stared at him for a long time without writing anything down. "You're telling me," the I.O. said slowly, "that you intentionally slowed down while being chased by 7 enemy fighters?" "Yes, sir. And that you did this at 15,000 feet, with no cloud cover and no support?" "Yes, sir. And that 3 of the enemy aircraft overshot your position because they couldn't match your deceleration?" "That's correct, sir." The I.O. set down his pen. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. "Lieutenant, do you understand how insane that sounds?" "Yes, sir." "Do you understand that what you're describing is tactically suicidal?" "It would be, sir, if the enemy had expected it, but they didn't." The I.O. picked up his pen again. He wrote something on the clipboard. Then he looked up. "You're aware that we lost 2 pilots today?" "Yes, sir." "And that you're the only survivor of the engagement?" "Yes, sir." "And that your story is going to be very difficult to corroborate because there were no witnesses?" Harwell said nothing. The I.O. studied him for another long moment. Then he sighed and closed the clipboard. "I'll write it up, but I'm flagging it for review. If the wreckage team finds evidence of 3 downed Zeros in that sector, your story holds. If they don't, we're going to have a very different conversation." "Understood, sir." Harwell was dismissed. He walked back to the officers' quarters, lay down on his bunk, and fell asleep before the sun went down. The wreckage team found 2 of the Zeros 3 days later. Both were half submerged in shallow water 8 miles northwest of the engagement zone. The third was never recovered, but a coast watcher on a nearby island reported seeing a Japanese fighter crash into the jungle on the afternoon of October 14th. The location matched. The timing matched. The I.O. filed his report without comment. It moved up the chain of command. Squadron level, air group level, fleet level. By the end of the month, it had reached the desk of a senior tactician at the Bureau of Aeronautics in Washington, D.C., who read it twice and then sent a priority message back to the South Pacific requesting additional details. What additional details did Lieutenant Harwell use to determine optimal deceleration rates during combat? Were calculations performed in advance or during the engagement? Was this maneuver reproducible by other pilots? Could it be standardized? The questions came back to Harwell through his squadron commander, a leathery Texan named McCready, who had flown Wildcats at Midway and had no patience for theoretical discussions. McCready called Harwell into his office, tossed a message across the desk, and told him to answer it. Harwell wrote a 3-page response. He explained energy management, explained deceleration rates as a function of weight, drag, and thrust, explained how a heavier aircraft in a low-power, high-drag configuration could decelerate faster than a lighter aircraft at high speed. He included diagrams, equations, references to the pre-war aviation journals he'd read. He also included a warning. The maneuver only worked if the enemy didn't expect it, if the enemy adapted, if Japanese pilots learned to anticipate sudden deceleration. The tactic would become lethal to the user. Surprise was the weapon, not the maneuver itself. McCready read the response, grunted, and sent it up the chain. He didn't say anything to Harwell, didn't congratulate him, didn't mock him, just filed the paperwork and moved on. But something changed in the squadron after that. The other pilots stopped calling Harwell professor. They stopped rolling their eyes when he pulled out his notebook during briefings. When he spoke, they listened. Not because they suddenly loved mathematics, but because mathematics had kept one of their own alive when Doctrine said he should have died. 2 weeks later, a fighter tactics instructor from Pearl Harbor flew out to the island. He spent 3 days interviewing Harwell, watching him fly, asking questions about energy states and controllability at low speeds. On the last day, the instructor took Harwell up in a 2-seat trainer and had him demonstrate the maneuver at altitude with no enemy present. Harwell pulled the throttle back, let the airspeed decay, kicked the rudder, and rolled into the skid. The trainer yawed sideways, hung on the edge of stall, then recovered as Harwell added power. The instructor didn't say anything during the maneuver, but when they landed, he shook Harwell's hand and told him the Navy would be adding a new section to the fighter tactics manual. It was called Energy Exploitation in Defensive Maneuvering. It would be taught to every Navy and Marine fighter pilot for the rest of the war. And in every version of the manual, in the footnotes at the bottom of the page, there was a reference to the engagement on October 14, 1943, and the name of the pilot who had proven that survival sometimes required doing the exact opposite of what common sense demanded. Thomas Harwell flew 62 more combat missions before the war ended. He shot down 4 more enemy aircraft. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. He was promoted to full lieutenant, and he continued to carry his notebook everywhere he went, filling it with observations and calculations that most people still didn't understand. But nobody mocked him for it anymore. After the war, Harwell went back to Indiana. He finished his degree in mechanical engineering. He worked for an aircraft manufacturer. He got married, had 3 kids. He never talked much about the war. When people asked, he'd give short answers and change the subject. The notebook, the one he'd carried through dozens of missions, ended up in a cardboard box in his garage. It stayed there for 30 years. In 1975, a historian researching naval aviation tactics tracked Harwell down. The historian had found references to the October 14th engagement in declassified after-action reports and wanted to know more. Harwell agreed to an interview. They sat in his living room for 4 hours, while Harwell walked through the engagement step by step, sketching diagrams on a legal pad, explaining the math in the same calm, methodical voice he'd used in the intelligence officer's shack 3 decades earlier. The historian asked him if he'd been afraid. Harwell thought about it for a long time. Then he nodded. "Every second," he said. "But fear doesn't change physics. The zeros were faster in a turn. I was heavier in a dive. They had numbers. I had predictability on my side. Once I understood the variables, the decision was obvious." "But it wasn't obvious to anyone else," the historian said. "Your own training said to dive. Your instincts said to dive. How did you know it would work?" "I didn't," Harwell admitted. "I knew it was possible. That's not the same thing. But possible was better than certain death." The historian published the interview in a military aviation journal. It circulated quietly among pilots and tacticians. The story became part of the oral tradition of naval aviation, passed down from instructor to student, briefing room to briefing room, generation to generation. The lesson wasn't about the specific maneuver. Most pilots would never find themselves in the exact situation Harwell had faced. The lesson was about the space between doctrine and reality, about the necessity of understanding principles instead of memorizing procedures, about the willingness to think clearly when everything around you is chaos, and about the fact that the most dangerous weapon in any cockpit isn't the gun or the missile or the engine. It's the mind of the pilot who refuses to stop calculating even when every nerve in his body is screaming at him to panic. The 7 Zeros that attacked Thomas Harwell on October 14, 1943, were experienced pilots from the 204th Air Group. They had flown combat missions over China, the Philippines, and the Solomons. They knew American tactics. They knew the strengths and weaknesses of the Hellcat. They had shot down Wildcats and Corsairs and P-38s. But they had never encountered a pilot who treated air combat as a math problem with a solution that required patience, precision, and the willingness to do something that looked like suicide from the outside, but made perfect sense if you understood the equations. They expected aggression. They got patience. They expected speed. They got deceleration. They expected predictability. They got contradiction. And in the 90 seconds it took them to realize their mistake, 3 of them died, and the other 4 learned that the war had changed. That American pilots were no longer just brave and aggressive. They were also smart, calculating, willing to exploit physics in ways that turned numerical advantage into tactical disaster. The Japanese Naval Aviation Command never issued a specific counter-tactic to Harwell's maneuver. There's no evidence they even fully understood what had happened. The surviving pilots reported that the American fighter had performed erratic and unpredictable maneuvers, that it seemed to stall but recovered instantly, that it had violated normal flight behavior. They didn't describe it as a tactic. They described it as chaos, which, from their perspective, it was. But from Harwell's perspective, it was the most organized and deliberate 90 seconds of his life. Every input was calculated. Every control movement was purposeful. The chaos wasn't in the maneuver. It was in the enemy's inability to predict it. That gap between perception and reality was the weapon, not the aircraft, not the guns. The weapon was the enemy's assumption that they understood the fight, and the moment they realized they didn't, the fight was already over. In 1985, the Navy established an annual award for innovation in fighter tactics. It was named after a test pilot who had pioneered carrier landing techniques in the 1950s. But in the first year, the selection committee added a special commendation category. It was for pilots who demonstrated unconventional tactical thinking under combat conditions. The first recipient was a posthumous award. The pilot had died 40 years earlier in a training accident, but his innovation, his willingness to think past doctrine and into the underlying principles of flight and combat, had influenced 2 generations of naval aviators. His name was Thomas Harwell, and the notebook he'd carried through the war, the one that had been mocked and dismissed and ridiculed by the men who should have known better, was donated to the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, where it remains on display today. Visitors can see it behind glass, pages filled with equations and sketches and notes written in neat, precise handwriting, calculations for turn rates and energy bleed and closure speeds, diagrams of aircraft in various attitudes, notes about wind resistance and propeller efficiency and the coefficient of drag. And on one page, dated October 13th, 1943, the day before the engagement, there's a single sentence underlined twice. If they expect speed, give them patience. If they expect distance, give them proximity. If they expect compliance with doctrine, show them that survival belongs to those who understand why the doctrine exists in the first place. He had written it as a reminder to himself, a note in the margin of a larger calculation about deflection, shooting, and lead angles. Just a thought, an observation. 24 hours later, it saved his life. The final irony of Thomas Harwell's story is that he never considered himself a hero. He rejected that label every time someone tried to apply it. In interviews later in life, he insisted that what he'd done wasn't brave. It was simply the logical response to the variables he'd been given. Bravery, he said once, is doing something dangerous without understanding the risk. What I did was understand the risk and choose the option with the highest probability of survival. That's not heroism. That's just arithmetic. But the men he flew with didn't see it that way. To them, the willingness to think clearly under fire, to calculate probabilities while cannon rounds were punching holes through your aircraft, to trust mathematics over instinct when every fiber of your being was screaming at you to run. That was a kind of courage they'd never seen before. And it was a kind of courage the war desperately needed. Because the war wasn't just won by pilots who could shoot straight or fly aggressively or endure pain. It was won by pilots who could adapt, who could see past the immediate chaos and understand the deeper structure of the fight, who could turn disadvantage into advantage by recognizing that the enemy's expectations were just as much a weapon as their own guns. Thomas Harwell died in 1998 at the age of 76. His funeral was attended by more than 200 people, including a dozen former fighter pilots who had flown with him or learned from him or studied his tactics. The eulogy was delivered by a retired admiral who had commanded carrier air groups in Vietnam and Desert Storm. The admiral told the story of October 14, 1943. He described the engagement, the odds, the decision, the outcome, and then he said something that stayed with everyone in the room. Tom Harwell taught us that the enemy isn't the aircraft across the sky. The enemy is assumption. The enemy is predictability. The enemy is the belief that there's only one way to fight. And the day you forget that, the day you stop thinking and start reacting, is the day you lose. He paused, looked around the room. Tom never stopped thinking. Not for a second. And that's why he's a hero, whether you like the word or not. The admiral folded his notes and sat down. The chapel was silent except for the sound of people trying not to cry. Afterward, at the reception, one of the younger pilots approached the admiral and asked a question. "Sir, do you think that maneuver would still work today, with modern fighters and missiles and radar?" The admiral considered it. The specific maneuver? Probably not. Technology changes. Tactics evolve. But the principle behind it? Absolutely. Because the principle isn't about throttles and airspeeds. It's about thinking 3 moves ahead while your opponent is still reacting to the last one. That never goes out of style. The young pilot nodded and walked away. The admiral watched him go. Then he smiled just a little and thought about a 23-year-old kid from Indiana who'd carried a notebook into combat and refused to accept that the impossible was impossible just because everyone said so. If you enjoy real World War II stories, where skill and courage change history, subscribe for more. The sky doesn't care how many aircraft you bring to the fight. It doesn't care about your rank or your experience or your reputation. It only cares about physics. And the pilot who understands that, who respects it, who uses it, will always have an advantage over the pilot who simply reacts. Thomas Harwell understood that. He lived it. And in 90 seconds over the Solomon Sea, he proved it in a way that would echo through the decades and remind every generation of fighter pilots that the most powerful weapon they carry isn't under the wings. It's between their ears. And it only works if they're willing to use it, even when everything inside them is screaming to do the exact opposite.